So, hello and welcome to Tribune's Shelf Life. I'm Mandira. I'm an independent journalist, and here I am with the hottest new book, um, Karan Mahajan's The Complex. It is a book which is believed to be the most awaited book this summer. It's a really incredibly complex book in many ways. It's an intergenerational family saga. It's a political book. So, welcome to Shelf Life, Karan. Thank you for doing this. And I would like to start off straight off with saying that this is your third book.
Mhm.
And in many ways, you return back to the city that you left, Delhi. So, what is with Delhi that you just, how does it somehow continue to be your muse even though you've left it?
Mm. Well, thank you, Mandira. Thank you for reading the book and for that question. I've wondered about that too, because obviously many people have mixed feelings about Delhi.
Yeah.
Um, I think some of it has to do with the fact that I felt that this particular milieu that I write about, which is like post-partition Punjabi refugees, Punjabi Hindus especially,
Mm,
there's a kind of stereotyping that happens about the community in movies, and I didn't feel that the full complexity of this community had been represented, both like the positives and the negatives. So that's one aspect. I think some of it was also that Delhi compared to Mumbai used to be underrepresented in Indian writing.
mm,
That's changed now. I think there's definitely lots of people do it well.
mm.
I'm thinking of Atish Tasir, Kiran Desai,
Yeah.
so on and so forth. Arundhati Roy's new memoir.
Yeah.
Um, but and also there's this other thing which I think is very specific to the kind of writer I am, which is that I became a writer once I left.
Mm,
And I think it was a way of trying to re-enter my own past and to try to make sense of the things that formed me. And the things that formed me were my childhood in Delhi, the different events that were happening around me that I was only dimly aware of. And
mm.
so with each novel, I'm trying to uncover some new area of darkness that I'm aware of.
I mean, I think what you said about it being underrepresented, Delhi being underrepresented is true. But I think also the books that you mentioned, whether it's Atish Tasir, Arundhati Roy's memoirs, or even Kiran Desai, it represents a different kind of Delhi. You know what I mean?
Yes,
You're
right.
talking about a completely different time. And what I thought is also really significant about the book is that if you look at the partition novel, okay, this
Mm,
is post-partition Delhi in at a point of time where, there has been you've written, Anita Desai, for example, has written about post-partition Delhi and
yeah,
the
totally.
struggles that exist, and she's talked about it in great detail, but also she also, talks about the darkness. And in
Right.
your novel, you deal with the darkness of this post-partition family, this patriarch that SP Chopra, who is this man who builds this life like all partition first generation people who settle here, and the family that then sort of tries to live up to this and never can. And my question, I have two questions really. In many ways, for someone who has not witnessed partition and who is some two generations away from it.
Mm, mm,
But there is an aspect of partition where we see it about now 80 years beyond,
right,
right? But it
right,
continues to have loom large um, in Delhi's life as well as the lives of Punjabis. In the sense that in
right.
some ways it is the silences that you never speak about. Also, the fact that, as one person said, that the last conquest of Delhi was a Punjabi conquest of Delhi. But there
Yeah,
is an
totally.
aspect of Punjab partition, second generation, that's still sort of the seed of that. So how do you, and in that, that trauma in some ways unleashes what
Mm,
happens in the book. So could you talk really
mm.
about how that affects you personally, how you grew up with partition, this word, and also how does that sort of, that trigger, which becomes Lakshman's victimhood later, how does that
Right.
work out both in your literary landscape as well as your personal?
Yeah, no, great question. I mean, I don't think one is conscious, of course, of having inherited any kind of trauma from partition, right? When one is
Yeah.
growing up or when it's living one's life. And I think that's why novels are an interesting way to reflect on that, because I'm certainly aware when I'm writing about this milieu that there is a lot of emotional violence, not even necessarily physical violence, and emotional pain. And the source of it is not always clear. Some of it can be particular to a family, particular to an individual, but um, certainly there's something about this attitude that this particular group of Punjabi refugees has, which was that, we have to keep moving forward and
Mm.
not introspect too much about what happened, which of course catches up with families, catches up with communities.
Mm. Actually, that's
And
Punjab.
definitely in Punjab, of course, the fault lines have been even clearer, right?
Yeah,
Because you have then you have the division of Punjab itself, then you
yeah.
have
The
all the
trifurcation.
stuff, the militancy that happened, and those are all aftershocks of kind of betrayed promises of partition.
Yeah.
In Delhi, it's weird because I think this is almost like, I think you put it well, Punjabi conquest of Delhi. It's like settler colonialism, like the way in the US has happened,
Mm.
where the people who were in Delhi, which was the Delhi Muslims, most of them got displaced and left.
Mm.
And you have these people now arriving who don't have any real connection to Delhi
Mm.
or to that Muslim past, who are living there. And of course, they have a very mixed attitude towards Muslims because
Mm.
they've experienced the great violence of partition and they've perpetrated a lot of violence against
Mm.
Muslims also. But
Mm.
I think there's this anti-Muslim strain definitely runs through the casual language that is deployed by people in these milieus. And also it's become more marked now, right? Now there's
Mm.
people are much
Yeah.
more emboldened to say that. So those things were floating around and I didn't quite understand why. I didn't understand what it meant.
Mm.
And I think that's one of the things with each novel, I'm able to zoom out a little bit more and say,
Mm.
okay, oh, actually, I am writing about Punjabis specifically. This is not about Delhi as a whole. Or I'm
Yeah.
writing about Punjabis from this particular part of Punjab who've come to Delhi. Or I'm
Mm.
writing about this kind of family in which the patriarch is this larger than life figure,
Mm.
partly because he was involved in one of the few untainted aspects of Indian life, which is the independence movement.
Yeah.
It's not like he was a politician in the 60s where there was corruption, right? So the children are living in this shadow, and it's a positive shadow, but they can't
Mm.
live up to it. They're not in touch with their own inherited traumas. They don't understand why they're behaving the ways they are. And so the worst aspect of that is getting a character like Lakshman, who's the youngest of the nine
Yeah.
children of S.P. Chopra, who thinks he's entitled to the greatness that that man achieved, and that being, a majority in his country should have access to everything. When he doesn't get it, he responds very badly. He tries to dominate the women in the family, the other
Mm.
members of the family, and then eventually moves into right-wing politics. So yeah, it's very mysterious, like how, to say how it affected me. I'm sure it affected me in huge ways.
Mm.
But that's why I write novels, is to kind of understand where the emotionals are personal and where they're coming from social or political change.
Yeah. So what I thought is also interesting is, and you've talked about, and I just want to sort of talk a little bit about the novel so that people hear. So, of course, it is a family, but it's also very much the story of India and how it unfolds. Through the
Right.
family, you talk about how India changes. So, you talk about you're sort of writing about the 80s, you're writing about Mandal, you're writing about you're writing about Babri Masjid, you're writing about
Mm.
84, the year you were born, the year that India
Right.
really changes. You're also talking about right-wing politics, and you've got a shadowy BJP
Right.
party
Right.
there. And I wanted to ask you, while you have the Rath Yatra, you have Lakshman, who is this possibly the least likable character, but the
Mm.
central character in this book. And you talk about something that we and the West, and I wanted to ask you, especially living
Right.
in America, where everybody looks at India now and says, "Oh my God, something happened about 10 years ago, or 20 or 15 years ago," but actually the thread
Right.
of majoritarian um, or the sweep actually starts much before. So can you
Right.
really talk about that? The fact that it is, how even in nonfiction, but even in fiction, we are sort of unraveling where this thread really comes from and why
Yeah,
you chose to write about it.
that's a great point, because also the novel kind of mimics that, in that, I was not conscious of trying to write a novel that combined personal and political. I didn't even think that, there would necessarily be a ton of politics in it,
Yeah,
but it evolved very gradually. Basically, the characters, Lakshman starts moving more and more um, away from what he thinks of as, socialist Congress, Nehruvian politics,
yeah,
towards this other thing, which at the time is more inchoate, which is kind of like, okay, he's going to supply some bombs to RSS shakhas.
yeah,
Then from there, he sort of gets involved with, the equivalent of the BJP at the time, which is a small party, this,
yeah,
what I call the TPP in the novel. And he, from that, starts to, feel that, oh, like, this party is being left behind and Hindus are being left behind, and there's some kind of sinister plot behind it, right? So, um, that the way I enact that in the novel is, of course, how it's happened in real life too, which is that these threads have been around forever.
mm,
They didn't start obviously in 91 or in 92
yeah,
or 93. They started like in the before, like in the 1800s.
yeah,
Even if you look at the texts of, some of the Hindu reformers, they were writing
yeah. Especially in
anti-Muslim,
Punjab.
anti-Christian things, especially in Punjab. And so I wanted to try to do it subtly. I wanted to say that, this is, none of this is a sudden development. I'm also very wary of these narratives of New India,
Yeah,
or the new Hindu nationalist India. It's actually something much more subtle is going on, which is
yeah,
that people who always held these attitudes have been given permission and are giving each other permission to say things that used to be forbidden. And then the conversation starts shifting more and more to the right, so that what becomes acceptable suddenly
yeah,
is something that was unacceptable 30, 40 years ago. So Lakshman also is interesting because, of course, his behavior is so unacceptable in many ways. But
yeah.
he ends up becoming, and I'm not really giving anything away. In the beginning of the novel, we learn
Yeah.
that he has become the great martyr of the family that
Of
everyone looks up to. He's the new SP Chopra. His sins have
yes,
been forgotten. In fact, his sins
yes.
have been celebrated.
So I also wanted to talk really about how you begin the novel. You have a note, okay, where you say, this book, you are the literary executor of this, of a novel that comes in this thing, and there is Mohit, who's the narrator part of
Yeah,
this.
yeah,
And I wanted to talk about the aspect of this fracture, which you have said was very interesting, where fiction, non-fiction
mm,
sort of blends, where your mind knows that it is fiction, but your heart feels it's real, even with your
right,
TP, characters. You've got your leaders thinly disguised, but
right,
there
right,
is this aspect of what is real, what is made up, what has happened in Mandal. You see, obviously Rajiv Goswami. You have,
right,
you
right,
have the Ames thing. So there is all that, right? But
right,
yet
right.
it's fictional. It's plausible. And can you talk a little bit about that and how that is an interesting device? And you've looked at it many times over. You've looked at it in your last book.
Yeah. No, it's totally true, because I used to be, there's something very uncomfortable about writing realism. Like, I didn't start out writing realism. My first novel, Family Planning, is much more of a comic novel. It kind
Yeah.
of um, exaggerates things in real life for comic effect. And then with my second novel, The Association of Small Bombs, I started to write, you know, a kind of realism. I mean, it's still inflected by the form of the fable and so on, but
Mm.
taking a real place and a real event and then heavily fictionalizing the characters around it and inhabiting worldviews and people's perspectives who obviously I didn't have access to. So I remember at the end of that novel, I felt a little uncomfortable. I said, should I have changed, for example, Lajpat Nagar to a fake market, right? Should I have changed certain landmarks? Because, I don't want to necessarily make anyone feel their experience has been, if someone had
Exactly.
been injured in that bombing, I
Yeah.
don't want them to feel I've
Yeah.
appropriated the experience
Yeah.
or I've somehow made light of it. Of course, I was doing it respectfully, I felt, but nevertheless, there's always this feeling of this was a real thing that happened to real people.
Mm.
But it struck me that it is kind of an unavoidable problem of realism, which is that you derive so much of the strength and the connection with your readers from real settings and this hint of reality. So I decided with this novel, I was not going to worry too much about that. In fact, I was going to make it part of the frame of the novel itself.
Yeah.
That this, right from the outset, I'm saying to the reader, this could be real, this could be fake.
Mm.
I'm going to play with this. So it makes it clearer to the reader, I hope. I mean, it's not necessarily going to, sometimes it might confuse the reader too, that when real places, real names are brought up, they're still being handled in a fictional way.
Mm.
And this is a third space that is being created. It's almost the way a dream functions, right?
Yeah.
Where like a dream will have real things that have happened plus a few imaginary things.
Mm.
And that's when I think fiction is the strongest. But I think this is a question I'll keep returning to again and again because I don't have a complete, clear ethical answer to it yet. And I actually think most realist writers don't. This is why there's so much discomfort around, is it autobiographical? Is it not? Is it made up? Is it not?
I mean, I think it's interesting. Now, can I also talk about the women? And I also wanted to talk about marriage. You have this wonderful line, though I wanted to talk about that, which is where Geeta is at the wedding before the crucial scene, which is sort of the engine to the thing. And she says Punjabi men in weddings, this is what she's grown up with. Okay. So there is that aspect of the Punjabi man in a space.
Right, right,
And it is a different reality from what you said, Bollywood, but it's also a different reality than it is, Bollywood is also not real, right? This is
right.
possibly
Of course.
closer to reality.
Yeah,
And we've
yeah,
sort of made the big Punjabi wedding into this deeply
yeah.
coveted. So it's been India's biggest success export,
Totally,
right?
totally. Yeah,
And can
yeah.
can you talk a really bit about that? How, in many ways, that really becomes the central aspect. Weddings and marriages, and and property, which you said it should have been at some point. I think in some interview that should be part of Punjabi expression because there is this aspect of right. So these three central things and how they play out in the book too. The marriages that you look at, Geeta and Sachin, possibly the most equal marriage, a love
Right.
marriage, Lakshman and Arjuna, and Karishma and Bridge. And how do you sort of frame that?
Well, one thing I will say that is hilariously autobiographical is just that I did attend a lot of Punjabi weddings growing up. I mean, there was just like always, I felt like every
Yeah.
weekend. So it's a setting I'm very familiar with. And the other is I hadn't realized this till I was almost done with the book. These things that you do unconsciously as a writer, where I realized, oh wow, the novel's first sort of major dramatic scene is this wedding scene. And in it, basically, Geeta and Lakshman are entering into a kind of negative marriage, a marriage of violation. Like
Yeah.
they're not, but that's, it's almost like the whole novel is being framed by this thing of a wedding is not actually a place that's safe. A wedding is a place where all sorts of other things can be happening under the surface of celebration, right? And then that thread follows through, which is that, and I do think it's very much a novel about marriage, where there are these uneasy partnerships and silences. And I would say silence, especially, is striking to me because I think I have another line in the novel, which is like having another person's voice in your
Voice in your
head.
head,
That
which
was
is yeah, is that's what marriage is.
yeah, and so that is true even of Lakshman and Archana. It's
Yeah.
true even of Bhuj and Karishma. They're deeply aware of each other, even if they don't like each other. And it's true of Geeta and Sachin as well.
Yeah.
And so I did want to show different shades of what these marriages can look like. Again, like I don't think I've gotten into like a great marriage in any of these, but Geeta and Sachin felt to me like a realistic depiction of a dissatisfying but fundamentally safe marriage where they like each other, they can't communicate, they try, they fail. Eventually, they find some kind of way forward and they find a joint ideology in a way, which is that they can form a life that is not bound by conventional notions of like childbirth or conventional notions of like this is how you must interact with your family and save face. The other marriages are interesting because I think like in some ways Lakshman, even though he's such a negative character, has somewhat like the most realistic attitude, I think, towards the
Yeah.
randomness of marriage, where he's just kind of like, I'm just going to do my own horrible thing. Like this, these marriages are just, these things that exist that have been foisted on us. And then you have Bridge and Karishma, which is a marriage of extreme disappointment, where there actually was some promise at the beginning, and the extreme disappointment has haunted both of them forever and drives Karishma into the arms of Lakshman. So, and then of course, Lakshman and Karishma have a relationship that in its own way becomes a kind of secret marriage.
Yeah.
So I did wonder, I was thinking, like, I did think at the end of it, I was like, it would be, I'd love to write a novel that doesn't have a marriage in it next, because I've really explored it deeply here.
I think you also say in the book where it is they're sort of they love each other, but they do not have anything to converse with each other, which I
Yeah.
think ends up being very much modern marriage. So in very many ways, they represent the modern marriage in lots of modern marriages. So I think there is that, and I would like to talk also about the fact that you've talked about writing these, the misogynistic or the patriarchy that they grew up, that the women operate out of, right? So you've got Archana, you've got Geeta, who possibly is the only one who escapes it in many ways, but sort of, or resists it and has her own this thing. You've got Archana, you've got Karishma. And I would like you to talk about Karishma a little bit, because I think while
Mhm.
she is a victim,
Mm.
in many ways, she sort of, she has a really terrible marriage. Out of all of them, hers is
Right.
the worst, right?
Right.
Lakshman is a negative character, but you know what? In terms of his private married life, he's possibly not the worst man. I
He's
mean,
not,
apart from his
yeah,
philandering.
exactly. He's bad, but he's not conflicted. He just knows he's bad, and that kind of is
Yes,
like,
yes. So
yeah.
like Mohit says in the beginning, there's no pretense, there's no artifice. This is who
Right.
he is. Um, and my question really is, I find her one of the most interesting characters because she is self-aware later about her inability. In many ways, she is the contrast to Lakshman.
Yeah.
Um, with the kind of with her ambition, with what she's willing to do for the ambition,
Mm.
where and can you talk a little bit about that, about how Karishma came to you? I know Geeta was the first character who came to you, but
Right.
how does Karishma come to you?
Yeah, Karishma is probably my favorite character in the novel, not in the way of like favorite person, but the character who does feel the most complicated and original, because there's something about her that, I mean, it like moves me a lot, like, which is that she's got a kind of self-acceptance of how bad her situation is,
Mm.
and is trying to make sort of as much meaning as she can in a very limited space. And her space is limited because she's also not doesn't have like a family on her own, like her parents' side that she thinks she can go
Yeah.
to. And she is, has an abusive husband, and she's intelligent, but she realizes from the beginning, she has this realist sense that even this affair with Lakshman is going to be some kind of destructive thing. But I'm
Mm.
going to go along with it because I think I have this line: "She lived deathwards," and
Yes.
so she's almost like this kind of, as you said, she's a contrast to Lakshman, who is trying to almost gain power at every stage. She is not trying to gain power. I almost can't quite articulate what she's trying to do. She's just simply trying to find a space for herself, any space that she can. And when that space goes away, basically, is when, in some ways, her own life ends too.
Mm.
But also, she is outwardly very interesting because she's one of those people who other people are not able to help, because she is very opaque. She doesn't come across as being someone who is comfortable with other people. And that was an interesting person also to write, because she would be much more of a pure victim if she was Bichari Karishma. She's not. People are
Yeah.
like, she's kind of stuck up, right? So this way we misread people and what's happening inside them, I think that's an engine in the novel too. People are constantly looking at each other and misreading who the other person is.
Yeah. I mean, I think that and it is a really complex novel. I mean, in the sense that it is a novel that is um, is a novel that somehow stays at the back of your head. I think that there are
Mm.
various layers, and you sort of are looking back and various things at it and saying, okay, fine, this is, I like this, um, and I also, so you took about a decade to write it.
Yeah, I mean, on and off, yes. Like I would say, like from my last novel came out in 2016, this one came out in 2026. So the gap was 10 years, but I probably, yeah, worked on it for 6, 7 years at the very least.
I want to go back to when you were born in 84, this life-changing year for this thing.
Mm.
It's a year that really changes India. You've got
Mm.
the Sikh massacres, you've got in Indira Gandhi. We are sort
Mhm.
of openly, she's openly stoking fundamentalism
Right.
in Punjab. You've got Delhi, you've got this thing, and you're born in this very blood-soaked year, and then the 80s, the sort of coalition politics and this thing take over. And I wanted to ask you, you talk about the Mandal Commission and this
Mm.
being an important part of the book, and how you know you sat and wrote that whole section in one sitting. And I wanted to ask you, like, why does that become such a defining moment? And as someone who was born
Right.
in that this thing, how does that become then this how do you identify it as this moment that India sort of is still sort of living with the shock waves of something that was started then?
Yeah, and it's funny, even as you're saying that, I'm trying to remember why I was so obsessed with writing about the Mandal Commission. Because, of course, yes, there's historical reasons and so on, but it's and it has continued to have widespread repercussions. But the question would be why for this family, why then?
Yeah.
I think one reason, of course, is that it was one of those few times when bourgeois, upper caste, middle caste students, Savarnas, were everyone was out in protesting, right? They had this great fervor, of course, and I'm always interested in when people are protesting in my mind for the wrong thing, when people are on the wrong side of history. Right? So they're
Mm.
protesting reservations for OBCs and so on. I mean, I think we can argue about what was politically motivated, what was not, so on. But I think I really did feel that if there was going to be a moment where realistically a character from this family could be cast into a mass movement, that would be the one. That um and that Mohit in this novel, he's a character who appears a little later in the book. He's a narrator of the book as well. Um, he would be in college in the 90s.
Mm.
Um, he's someone whose perspective I could enter a little more easily too, and I
Mm.
could because he's just a little older than me, and a kind of misguided idealist who has, in some ways like me, has a vague sense that there's this giant infrastructure of partition, of the past, of the patriarch, of violence sitting on his back, knows that something is wrong with his family, senses his mother is having an affair, wants to do something about it. But of course, this is not a family where people talk to each other directly about anything that matters. I mean, that's the problem with this entire family. And so they all express each other indirectly. And in his case, like Lakshman, his way of expressing himself is through joining the Mandal Commission protest
Mm.
and accidentally becoming quite central to it, being sort of close to the main the person who immolates, and that then sets off a cascade of consequences because it also kind of introduces gradually more physical violence into the novel. So you have the 1984 riots, and you have this, and then you finally have this bigger act of violence within the family. And so it all starts to feel like one thing is leading to another. But again, I'm not completely aware. I mean, some of these things are mysterious. They just like you're drawn to
Disappear.
them. I don't know why I was drawn to writing so much about that last bit, Bible Blast. I really was.
Mm.
I think some things just have make an impression on you when you're a kid, and you have to just kind of respect that it's almost like a tear in the fabric of time where you're being asked to enter it and you have some way in. And if you explore it wholeheartedly, something will come out of it. It might not even be right, but you would have learned something, and hopefully the reader also will learn something.
Yeah, that's an interesting way to do it. Say now, so
Yeah.
my last question is really is that Bridge, the character who is possibly like Lakshman, um,
Right.
um, you know, very there's very little to redeem him. All the other characters you have this thing, but Lakshman and Bridge sort of find themselves, um, and you're sort of deeply uncomfortable with them. You
Yeah.
don't like them, right? And yet he finds all that he's looking for, validation, uh,
Right.
fame in jail. And can you talk a little bit about that? Um,
Yeah, one of the saddest sections of the novel for me, and also one that I really liked writing, is the moment where we pull back the veil on Bridge and we understand why he became the person he did, right? I
yeah.
think that's a kind of technique I use in my writing a lot, where like I will write about a kind of human behavior out of anger. Like I'll think, okay,
Mm.
this kind of person, I don't like that they behave this way. I don't like that a character like Lakshman acts this way towards women. But after a while, the anger turns to curiosity. Why did they become like this? What happened? How are they justifying it to themselves? And with Bridge, that happened where he's almost a comic character at times, where he's
Mm.
so contrarian, says the opposite of whatever anyone thinks, wants to create discomfort in any scene he enters into, has a slight sense of malice. But then you realize he's such a deeply hurt and disappointed person that he wanted so badly to have love. He wanted so badly to succeed. And he still has this very secret ambition for his children that
Yeah.
he will not admit it openly because that'll mean breaking the veil, breaking the carapace he's built around himself. But that this last thing is what's keeping him in this particular circuit of the family and this web of relationships, that he hopes he can get some money to send his kids abroad. He decides, my brother did so well abroad. Of course, the brother doesn't necessarily think that about
Yeah.
himself. And so he, like Karishma, by the end of the novel, you start to, I think, with Karishma, you sympathize with more, but I think with Bridge too, you start to see, oh, this is another way in which the disappointment of the family has come out and has been satisfied.
I mean, I think that what you do with the characters is that you really sort of give you an insight into them. So I mean, there are points of time when Lakshman does redeem himself as well as Edge, but they choose then something where they continue to act in character,
Right,
in a
exactly.
way. And I think that is what it is. And I think it's, I think it's powerful to write about people who are actually realistic, and
Right.
complex, and people um, who are also not cuddly. But I think there is merit in that too. So thank you so much, and thank you for being part of this. And it is really a wonderful book. So I would recommend that everybody should buy The Complex. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mandra. Thank you for the great questions.